Okay, hi guys, and welcome to the show. And today we are reviewing a beautiful pair of constellations from Omega. Now, before I get into this, I have to say a massive thank you to Derek at Moyer Jewelers. They are authorized dealers for Omega and plenty of other great top brands. As you guys know, I would only ever recommend the very best for my audience. And before we get into it, I'll also do a quick wristwatch check. There we go. I'm wearing the Explorer on the Valor strap, which I co-designed for Wrist Candy Watch Club. I'll leave the link to that down below. Probably my favorite watch and strap combination. Yeah, absolutely adore it. So anyway, let's get a bit of context and get into the history. Before the watch world-changing trilogy of 1957, the Constellation was king. First introduced in 1952, it was one of Omega's oldest continually running family of watches, second only to the Seamaster. Its genesis, however, started a few years earlier in 1948 with the Centenary watch. This was the brand's first limited edition chronometer certified wristwatch with an automatic movement. Omega wanted to create a new higher end collection that would always be chronometer certified and distinguish it from the more affordable options. Thus, the Constellation was born. Two features distinguished the first members of the new Constellation family: a star and a name above the 6 o'clock marker, and a sealed caseback with a medallion featuring the Observatory of Geneva, which was crowned by a constellation of 8 stars, honouring the 8 precision records Omega had earned. They were originally destined for men, and the first models were fitted with the calibers 351, 352 and 354 with bumper rotors. That was soon replaced 4 years later with my favourite of all in-house calibers, the 500, the 500-01 and the 505. And then of course in 1966 with the caliber 561 for the date model, and eventually the 564, of course. Stylistically, during this golden era, the Connie, as they have affectionately become called, featured a 12-sided dial with a raised central area and sloping peripheral chapter ring for the hour markers, and sometimes these would be quite ornate. The dial looked like an upside-down pie pan, giving the watch a charming sense of depth and originality, which also led it to the colloquial name too. The pie pan dial would slowly be phased out during the 1960s and not returned until the 2000s with the current Globemaster that I've also reviewed. Available in steel, two-tone and luxurious gold, the case shape of this period remained round, but the lugs, hour markers, dial details and bracelets varied extensively. By the mid-1960s, flat dials were introduced along with more interesting case shapes and sizes, including the Constellation for ladies. In fact, the Constellation was first in having the integrated bracelet with the case. Omega had already invented this design back in 1964, but it would take several years before making its debut in 1969, eventually permeating into several other lines of watches. With the arrival of the quartz crisis, this marked an unusual time for Omega as a brand and its creations. Omega tried to embrace the quartz revolution and presented 3 lines of watches with their super high-end quartz calibers, and at the 1970 Basel Fair, one of them was the Constellation Electro Quartz F8192 Hz. Aesthetically, what followed was an array of odd space-age looking creations, as the brand desperately tried to stay relevant in a drastically changing and volatile industry. It would not be until 1982, with the introduction of the Constellation Manhattan family, that the brand and the Constellation line as a whole would return to a more consistent aesthetic and a design language that would stand the test of time, even becoming iconic to this very day. The first Manhattan models were equipped with a ultra-thin quartz caliber 1422, developed jointly with ETA. It wasn't until 1984 that an automatic version appeared with the COSC-certified caliber 1111, famously based on the venerable workhorse caliber by ETA, the 2892-2 movement. The Manhattan is sometimes mistakenly attributed to Gerald Gentry, and it's easy to see why. It followed his pattern of integrated bracelet and modernist bold shapes, especially on the fixed bezel. Gentry had been involved in the design of various components of the Omega Constellation over the preceding 30 years, but the Manhattan was actually the work of a new hired jewellery designer called Carol Didisheim. Astonishingly, she was only 26 at the time and had started on the project in 1981. The result was a distinctive collection with claws extending from the case over the dial, positioned at the 3 and 9 o'clock. These highly polished claws would become a signature hallmark feature of the Manhattan. But they were not there merely aesthetically. They also performed the practical function of holding the sapphire crystal and gasket firmly against the case, giving the watch a slimmer case profile and improved water resistance. To give the wearer a more luxurious feel, all the edges were rounded, giving a sense of refinement, assisted by the hinged links in the tapering bracelet that also assisted its articulation and comfort. By 1995, the Roman numerals on the dial had migrated to the bezel, and in 2003 the Constellation Double Eagle was launched and upgraded with Omega's first highly innovative coaxial caliber escapement, the 2500, that we have discussed so many times. Then the Manhattan was given a full makeover in 2009 that continued subtly to evolve over the next 10 years into what we have today. So what has changed? Well, let's find out in just a moment with the newer 2020 incarnation. The unavoidable fame and iconic status of the C and Speedmasters very much keeps the Constellation in the shadows somewhat. The Seamaster has James Bond now, and it had Jacques Cousteau and a ton of military involvement over the decades. And the Speedy, as we all know, with its never-ending space-going celebrity status. But that has not stopped the Constellation having its own moments of pop culture stardom. Aside from being more synonymous with the Hamilton Ventura, Elvis actually did own and wear an original 1950s Constellation in a gorgeous pink gold and a rare black sniper dial. Al Pacino, playing Michael Corleone in the massively influential Godfather trilogy, wore a similar vintage model with a white dial on a yellow gold bracelet. I love this watch casting choice as it was reserved and classy, matching the understated and calculated character perfectly. Don Corleone wasn't a cartoonish portrayal of a mob boss, nor a flashy and loud rags-to-riches criminal. If you remember the plot, he didn't even want to go into the family business until conspiring events inevitably pulled him in. He was stylish, sophisticated, and there to do business, just like the watch. So as I mentioned earlier, there are now 3 sizes available: 36mm, 39 and 41. Now for my 6¼ inch wrist, I really like the 39. I think it's absolutely spot on. They're all around about the same height. I'll leave the details of the precise dimensions all on the screen now. The weight does vary depending on how many links you take out of the integrated bracelet, obviously, but if they're on the strap, then the weight is fairly consistent. Now in terms of materials, this is where it gets quite interesting. You can have a choice of Sedna gold, which is a kind of rose gold. There's yellow gold, two-tone, and now of course steel. Both of these are in steel. However, the 41mm versions have these ceramic bezels with the numerals are actually, I thought it was just printed on, but it's not. It's liquid metal, so therefore you cannot rub it off, and the way it's flush with the actual bezel is very impressive indeed. They've come a long way in mastering this particular style. I mean, you cannot feel that it's engraved and then liquid metal deposited in. It's very impressive indeed. Now, as you can see, directional brushing depending on where it is. So on the top, it's kind of concentric, following the lines of the watch, and then on the sides, it's horizontal, and then of course all the little details like the hinge sections and the beveling and of course the claws on the side are in a high polish. So this particular 41 is the blue version with that utterly beguiling midnight blue. I have to say I prefer the more traditional engraved bezel, but we'll discuss that in just a moment. This particular 41 comes on a strap which has a really nicely done rubber underside. Obviously this is going to have contact with your skin. It's impeccably well stitched, very robust feeling, and then on the top it's actually got a leather section which just makes perfect sense. I mean, it has a more formal look on the outside. You see the clasp, the double push button deployment there, really nicely done. I love this kind of hybrid strap. It makes it practical yet strong, but then look far more refined, far more kind of what's the word, less sporty than sometimes rubber straps can make something look a little bit overly sporty. Now the crystal on both of these are of course sapphire crystal, anti-reflective coating on the inside and outside, nicely domed, and I really like the way they're just gently framed by the bezel. Look at this wonderful arched curve here. The case itself is almost slightly kind of tornado shaped, if you see that, but not the actual dial and bezel. And I just love how it tapers and meets the bracelet. I got to say, I love the bracelet more. There's a wonderful fluidity to it, but yet reassuringly solid. I actually kind of prefer this to the Royal Oak bracelet, but the only downside is we got traditional pins in between, and of course we don't have micro adjustment, but with these smaller sections here you get quite an accurate fitting. Of course, a double push button, butterfly deployment there. This just comes undone. The back does remind me somewhat of the Royal Oak, kind of porthole look to the case back, the screw-in case back there. Very cool. So inside we have some of, if not the best of what Omega has to offer. If you missed my previous reviews featuring the master chronometer movements, they are precisely that. The biggest change in the Constellation line occurred with the introduction of Omega's master chronometer certification in 2015. In addition to COSC chronometer certification, the master chronometer then goes a very impressive 8 further steps by replicating real-life wearing conditions to ensure the watch is resistant to magnetic fields and water. Very useful in today's digital world where magnetism is almost everywhere. Not just in cockpits of planes or recording studios. The laptop I am painstakingly editing on this very moment emits a strong disruptive field via the speakers next to the keyboard. So the caliber 8900 in the 41mm has 39 joules, while the 8800 in the 39 has 35. Both, however, have the ability to resist magnetic fields as strong as 15,000 Gauss. But the main difference is the 8900 has twin barrels, which boosts the power reserve to 60 hours over the 55 hours in the 8800. But not only are these latest automatic calibers as hard as nails, with their fully traversing balance bridges and impervious to magnetism via their silicon hairsprings, they also feature the world-changing, longer-lasting coaxial escapement, as well as being tarted up to the nines. We see an arabesque swirling finishing that is utterly mesmerizing, emphasizing the bidirectional sense of movement of the rotor. There's even some beveling, black heated screws and pelage on the base plate. The only downside of this movement is it is rather tall and still operates at the quirky frequency of 25,200 vibrations an hour in order to maximize efficiency over a longer period of time. So the dial, without a shadow of a doubt, of these watches is probably their most appealing feature. They are very subtly sunburst. It radiates outwards from the center, quite restrained. Sometimes you don't even notice it, just looks glossy, but then it's more apparent in the blue, obviously. Equidistantly placed is the script and the corresponding applied brand logo at the 12 o'clock. And then we have the classic faceted star at the 6, which I think is an important part because it links it back to the very first Connies and, of course, the observatory trials and the emblem we once saw on the case backs. Then we have simple printed white hash marks along with tapering applied multifaceted hour markers. These are quite interesting as they are inspired by the Manhattan skyline, the Freedom Tower in particular. If you imagine it as a skyscraper, you'll see what I mean. And it does a good job of just ever so slightly, as I move it, reflecting light, and it's a very cool effect. And I think it not only just evokes that that connection, but also complements these sections of the case, which are really, really cool. The hands I would describe as kind of classical lance style hands, very much going back to even the Art Deco period. But it works well because I think it's a stark contrast to the 80s vibe of the rest of it, but also matches the traditionalism of the engraved Romans. These are very distinctive characteristics of the Manhattan and its identity, I feel. The ceramic insert is a glossy Prussian blue, and the engraved all steel, for me, is very much reminiscent of the Stargate design in the television show, which actually I don't think is a bad thing. It kind of makes it more intriguing. The date window is symmetrically placed at the 6 o'clock, giving a satisfying kind of sense of balance and symmetry. And the decision to have the hinges of the bracelet where it connects in differing finishes also gives it a very distinctive look. And just look at the beveling; it's quite refined to the touch. You don't really get any harsh edges. And on the crown we have a blasted finish just to really highlight and accentuate the Omega logo. The positives here, I have to say, are far stronger than I expected. The build quality is supremely high, a long way from the early Bond Seamasters. That was very much my gateway watch into this brand. I simply could not find any fault with it in terms of its execution, and it goes without saying the performance was deadly accurate. It's almost unbeatable in its price range compared to most automatic mechanical watchmaking in that range. I greatly enjoyed the Royal Oak feeling it gave, so much so it actually made me slightly miss selling my old Royal Oak, and it's also got a refreshing character all of its own. I feel this watch is a compelling, more affordable luxury alternative to the Royal Oak, as well as the Vacheron Constantin overseas. Thankfully, despite the statuesque height of the movement, the watch was, on the whole, not too thick, and like the AP, very versatile when it comes to attire, working very well both formally and super casual. It's got a hybrid dressy but yet somehow still kind of masculine, modern and confident feel to it. From the METAS testing, the specifications, movement architecture, Omega have unquestionably finally returned to a level of excellence here unseen since the 1950s glory days, with something that is actually better than anything their greatest nemesis, Rolex, have to offer for the same price. But I think its main advantage is that it's far less predictable of a choice. With a strong history behind it, despite being a victim to some degree of the success of its more famous siblings, it's a far cooler choice that is boosted immeasurably by being now available in 3 outstanding size options. With my current penchant for yellow gold, I only wish there was a full gold or perhaps a two-tone with a black dial available in 39mm. I would strongly consider it. So what about its negatives? Well, for me, the biggest downfall was the lume. It seems that only the hands have been treated with a very diminutive amount of lume. That's not actually the issue, and I'm fine with that, but there's no lume on the actual dial. I would have loved to see perhaps even tiny lume dots at the wider end of the hour markers, because you don't get any sense of orientation in low light without something on the dial. Secondly, I'm glad that they kept the claws there. I do think it's integral to the Constellation, or the Manhattan rather, I should say. But it's a shame they're not actually functional. I feel like it's just not an empty gesture. I don't know. It's a bit difficult to describe that. Thirdly, the crown, although it's beautifully done, it's not my favorite. I understand they went for this conical shape, kind of nod to the Paipan era, but it's just not practical. It's not the most ergonomic. I found it quite a pain when I wanted to top up the manual wind, or to hack it and to set, or change the quick set date. I actually preferred the coin edge that the progenitor Manhattans had. Lastly, the lack of adjustment on the integrated bracelet. Not the end of the world, because as I explained, they have the smaller links closer to the clasp, so you can get quite a good fit, but it'd be nice to have some kind of system integrated into the clasp where you could just do a quick micro adjustment. And also that leads on to your strap options. You are limited to what Omega sell you, to either, you know, a strap like this. Even though this strap is absolutely outstanding, you're kind of dependent on Omega, unless there's third-party strap makers out there. I don't know, but yeah, it's not the strap monster. And also, as we're on the subject of this 41, I'm not a fan of the ceramic insert. While it is done exquisitely well, there's something about the engraving look of this that just, you know, really does it for me. I think that's more to do with personal taste, so not really fair to say it is a negative, but you're probably going to either like one or the other. I guess it's just personal preference, not my cup of tea. Lastly, I would have preferred 100 meters instead of the 50 meters water resistance it has. So in conclusion, I have to be very frank here. I was never a fan of the newer Manhattan Connies. I felt it suffered from a kind of overspill of the identity crisis, as it was too much of a dramatic shift away from the originals. The culmination, in my eyes, of the turbulent 1970s, as Omega could not really decide what to make it into. The golden era of Omega will always, for me, be the 1950s, hence why the only Omega currently in my personal watch collection is from that age. Both in terms of style and movement making, my little gold late 50s Seamaster automatic is powered by the caliber 500, the same legendary caliber that went on to power the iconic military Seamasters of the 1960s. The previously reviewed Globemaster that debuted in 2015 marked a comeback for the Pie-Pan dials in the Constellation family, along with a design language more consistent with the past. To me, it makes sense that now the Constellation line is essentially split into two subgroups, with this particular Manhattan style feeling like a logical culmination and more refined continuation of its 80s predecessors that I now actually am starting to like. So they have succeeded generally. While it is not absolutely perfect, the result that evokes the experience of a Royal Oak more than dressy Connie. And we have to respect that it is entirely proprietary made, like the Golden Age, so a kind of return to form. The AP made history by being the first super luxury sports watch in steel in the 70s, but essentially it was a dress watch movement in a tougher exterior. The Manhattan very much is the opposite. The caliber comes from a tool or sports watch origin, then housed in something trying to be more dressy. The AP has an unmistakable brutalist 1970s aesthetic with a maritime twist, hence the name. The Constellation we have here today feels more like the 80s with a slight Art Deco vibe, thanks to the curves and Roman numerals. Dare I say, even a little Giugiaro-esque. Now, after a week of wearing it, I feel somewhat fully converted. It's got a class and distinctive elegance all of its own. It's actually had the same effect on me as the Rolex Explorer once did, a watch I once considered too boring and unremarkable. Then I wore it for a week, and today it's a permanent keeper. This watch once again proves you have to try it to fully appreciate it. Without a shadow of a doubt, the most underrated watch Omega makes. So there you have it. Let me know your thoughts, queries, comments, opinions, all the rest of it down below. What do you make of the Constellation line? Which is your favorite era or reference? And what Omegas would you like to see reviewed next? Please do share your feedback. I love hearing from all of you. Don't forget to like this video. Very important indeed. And I will catch you in the next one. Thank you for watching. Ciao.